107 years. That's how long Aston Martin have been building cars. And over a century later, they've finally done the unthinkable. Or is that the obvious? They've finally made an SUV.
And this is it, the Aston Martin DBX. It's designed to deliver on all fronts: luxury, performance, looks. But it faces some stiff competition from established players like the Lamborghini Urus and Bentley Bentayga. Aston Martin are very, very late to the party. And if you're this late, you're gonna have to bring something special.
And they've definitely brought something very special. Power comes from a twin turbocharged Mercedes-AMG derived V8, the same one you get in the Vantage and in the DB11. And it is an absolute stonker of a motor, this thing. In those cars, it makes 500 horsepower. In this, 550. How's it doing that? Well, they've used updated turbochargers, uprated charge coolers, and an improved compression ratio. And it is really, really strong. It sounds absolutely phenomenal as well. It's a Mercedes engine, but it's an Aston Martin exhaust. Mercedes times Aston Martin equals eargasms every single time.
So it's decent in a straight line, but it's worth noting that some of the SUVs the DBX goes up against are significantly quicker. This does 0 to 62 in 4.5 seconds, but the similarly priced Lamborghini Urus manages that sprint in around 3.6. But what it lacks in straight line performance, it makes up for with playful cornering.
It's got some interesting driving dynamics, this car. It kind of behaves not like an SUV, but more like a rear-wheel drive sports car. It's got an active center diff, which sends most of the power, most of the time, to the rear wheels. And depending on what driving mode you're in and how much slip you get from the front axle, it will then shuffle the torque towards the front to help pull you out of trouble. But the majority of time, it does feel rear biased. And that means when you get into a corner, get on the power early, and the back end does want to rotate. Fair play to Aston Martin. There aren't that many SUVs with as playful a back end as that. And you can understand why. Most car manufacturers probably don't want their customers swapping ends on a greasy roundabout in Milton Keynes.
Aston Martin have thrown a lot of technology at the DBX in a bid to help it through the corners. Most notably EARC, the electric anti-roll control system. Basically Aston's name for the 48-volt anti-roll stabilization gizmos you get to reduce body roll. This can apply 1,400 Newton meters of anti-roll force per axle, which is up there with the most powerful. For every G of cornering, it can maintain less than half a degree of body roll.
You've got to give credit where credit is due. This car stays unbelievably flat through the corners, but that was never going to be this car's problem. This car's problem, like all performance SUVs, is its weight. It weighs 2,145 kilograms, and while by performance SUV standards that's not absurd, it's actually lighter than a Bentley Bentayga. It's lighter than a Bentley Continental GT, but you can still feel that weight, particularly when you're coming into these low-speed corners. A little bit of oversteer there, but predominantly the feeling you get from the car is understeer. If you go in too hot, the car doesn't seem to want to turn in with the same eagerness as you might expect from one of Aston Martin's lower, lighter cars.
Power goes through an 8-speed automatic gearbox rather than a dual clutch unit. That's now par for the course with performance SUVs, as it allows for better towing performance and smoother road driving, even if it ultimately isn't as snappy as a dual clutch unit.
But guess what? The gearbox in this actually feels quite responsive. It gives you a slight interruption in the power when you upshift, to give you that slight shove in the back to let you know that you're involved with the driving experience. And while it doesn't quite want to shift down, particularly from third to second gear, you can drive around that problem. There's so much torque in this, 700 Newton meters, that second gear, pretty much unnecessary.
Even though the DBX has a wealth of tech, rear-wheel steering is noticeably absent. Some of this car's dynamic rivals, like the Porsche Cayenne Turbo and Audi RS Q8, use this system to good effect, helping it to turn in more directly at lower speeds. And here, the DBX can struggle.
The brakes are an interesting one. They've chosen not to equip this car with carbon ceramic brakes, and I think that hurts the DBX slightly. After a couple of big stops out here filming today, the brakes did start to get quite hot. Aston Martin have been pretty brave in letting us fire this thing around the track, but it's just not a car you take on a track day. But it's still a lot of fun. I'm actually enjoying myself. What you need to learn to do is to drive around this car's weight issue. Scale it back ever so slightly, drive it at 8 or 9/10. Just be patient, particularly on the entry of a corner. That's where this car starts to make most sense. Don't hustle it like a sports car. Treat it like an SUV. Understand its limitations. And this is a car you can actually enjoy.
Driving fast is obviously very important to Aston Martin's customers, but do you want to know what's even more important? That's right, looking good. When you buy a £150,000 super SUV, you want the world to know about it and to respect the fact that you've bought something very nice. And the good news is that the DBX is at least distinctive. I'll let you make your own mind up about whether it's attractive, but what I will say is that it looks a lot better in person than it does in pictures. It's got all the familiar Aston Martin hallmarks. For example, the grille, enormous, the biggest they've ever fitted to any Aston Martin vehicle. The badge, equally enormous, but I guess it's at least in proportion with the rest of the car. Along the side, they've done their best to disguise just how massive this thing is by incorporating some sculpted elements along the door. Plus, you get typical Aston Martin door handle. The wheels, by the way, are 22s. I think they're a little bit small. 23s would have filled those arches slightly better. Around the back, they've tried their best to make this look a bit like a Vantage. On a small, low-slung sports car, all of those elements end up looking really, really nice. But on a big, bulbous SUV, does it look like an Aston Martin or a caricature of an Aston Martin?
Once you get past the challenging shape, there are plenty of interesting details. These DRLs are an integral aerodynamic part, helping to reduce drag by sending air to the front fender via the wheel arch. These bonnet vents are exhausted towards the windscreen, while this rear wing forces air down the screen, helping it to self-clear of water without the need for a wiper. Clever.
The technology is pretty decent too. It uses a Mercedes-derived infotainment system which consists of 2 separate displays. One up here for all your driving information and a second screen for all your navigation and media playback. It's not the most comprehensive setup in the world, but the features that are there, Bluetooth, DAB, etc., are easy to control via this central rotary knob in the center console. Now, practicality, very important in an SUV, and I've got to say, I'm actually quite impressed by the DBX. First and foremost, you get this huge cubby down here for storing all your bits and bobs, individually adjustable armrests and a couple of cup holders, plus decent sized door bins and a big glove box. Plus, if you've got extra stuff to store, then you can do so down here below this floating console. All in all, they've done a really decent job up here.
They've also done a decent job of helping the DBX SUV do SUV things. There's plenty of leg and headroom in the back for passengers, and the boot offers a sizable 632 litres of space, on paper bigger than a Urus and far bigger than a Bentayga. Aston has also done a great job of pretending its customers will take the DBX off-road. The adaptive air suspension can raise the car's ride height by 45mm or lower it by 50mm to help it tackle a variety of terrain. It also has useful additions like hill descent control and is surprisingly capable if you accidentally find yourself near some mud. Aston, we commend you, but let's face it, just as the DBX is unlikely to ever be driven on a racetrack, it's even less likely to be driven too far from tarmac.
Right, so we know it's sporty, we know it's got decent utility, but what's the DBX like out on normal roads where 100% of people are going to drive this car? Let's face it, no one's actually going to take one of these on a track, are they? Well, it's surprisingly good, surprisingly different. A minute ago, I was tearing around a racetrack, raising all hell with that exhaust note, but now I'm on the road and it's a completely different animal. You can tell that Aston Martin have worked incredibly hard to make this thing as quiet and as refined as possible, because there's no wind noise, there's no road noise, and that motor, even though you can hear it burbling away, is not too intrusive.
The air suspension is a dream too, working effectively to smooth out nasty bumps. Its ability to go from firm 1 minute to supple the next allows the DBX to feel at home in a variety of circumstances.
The driving position is worth talking about as well. It's not quite as commanding a seating position as you might find in something like a Range Rover. It's much more coupe inspired in that sense. You sit quite low down in the car. But despite that, I don't feel overly intimidated because I know exactly how big the car is and I feel confident in placing this thing exactly where I want it to go.
The brakes, which I felt were a little susceptible to fading, are great out here because they're easy to modulate, and let's face it, not everyone will be braking super hard on the school run. Where you'll use this car is on normal roads where smooth, progressive brakes are important, and these work well provided you're not too hard on them.
When you're out on the track, because of the amount of power and torque this car has, and because of the fact that its brakes are relatively susceptible to fading, I think that sometimes you can find yourself getting into trouble and pushing beyond this car's abilities and your own. Whereas out here on the road, when you've got things like speed limits and speed cameras and the danger of animals and pedestrians being on the road, you find yourself driving much more within your limits and also within the car's limits. And that's when this thing is far more enjoyable.
The DBX's performance envelope lends itself better to road than track. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that it's a better, more dynamic car to drive on the road than the Bentayga. I haven't yet driven the Urus on the public road, so the jury's out on that one, but you'd have to be pretty dead inside not to enjoy a spirited blast in a DBX.
Away from the limit, it just flows so nicely. The steering isn't hyperactive in the slightest. It's nice and progressive. The brakes aren't being asked to perform minor miracles. Understeer isn't an issue because you're not driving flat out anymore, and there is so much power, prodigious amounts of torque, that you can enjoy this car in all its glory.
Was the DBX worth the wait? Yes, it was. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Carbon brakes would have made it a far better performance car, as potentially would rear-wheel steering. But in the end, this is still enormously enjoyable to drive, more so than many of its peers. Yes, Aston Martin were massively late to the party, but now they're here, and sometimes, just sometimes, a party's not a party until the cool kids arrive.